The sun hung low over Willow Creek that dusty afternoon when Samuel Matthews rode into town with nothing but $23 in his weathered leather wallet and a heart still tender from losing his beloved Martha just 6 months before. Old Rancher had come to settle his monthly account at Henderson's General Store, but found himself drawn to the commotion near the courthouse steps, where a small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an auction of sorts. Samuel dismounted, his faithful horse Chester, and walked closer, his boots making soft sounds against the packed earth. His weathered hands adjusted his hat as he tried to understand what was happening before his eyes. There on a makeshift wooden platform stood a young woman, maybe 25 years old, with tangled auburn hair that caught the afternoon light like spun copper. Her simple dress was torn and stained, and rope bound her hands before her. But it was her eyes that stopped Samuel's heart. Those green eyes held no defeat, no surrender despite her circumstances. They blazed with a fierce dignity that reminded him of the wild mustangs he used to gentle on his ranch years ago, beautiful and untamed, even in captivity. "What's this about?" Samuel asked quietly, to old Pete Morrison, who stood nearby chewing tobacco and watching the proceedings with mild interest. "That there's Clara Whitfield," Pete explained, spitting into the dust. "Found her living wild up in the canyon for near 2 years now. Some say she lost her mind after her family died in that influenza outbreak. Others say she just chose to live free like an animal." Samuel watched as the auctioneer, a thin man with nervous hands, called out bids. The townspeople seemed more curious than serious about bidding on what they clearly saw as a burden rather than a person. "She's been stealing chickens and vegetables to survive." Pete continued. "Judge says someone's got to take responsibility for her, or she goes to the territorial prison. Can't have wild folk disrupting decent society," he says. The bidding was lackluster. Most folks in Willow Creek barely had enough to feed their own families, let alone take on what they saw as a damaged woman. The highest bid stood at 50 cents offered, by the town drunk who probably thought it was amusing. Samuel felt something stir deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt since Martha passed. It wasn't attraction exactly, but recognition, a kinship with another soul who had known loss and loneliness without really thinking about it. Samuel raised his hand. $1. The auctioneer looked surprised but nodded enthusiastically. $1 from Mr. Matthews. Do I hear 150? The crowd murmured, but no other bids came. Clara's eyes found Samuel's across the dusty space between them, and for a moment time seemed to pause. She studied his face with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced in months. Going once, going twice, sold to Samuel Matthews for $1. As the small crowd began to disperse, Samuel approached the platform where Clara still stood bound. The sheriff, Jim Bradley, who had known Samuel for 15 years, looked at him with concern. "Sam, you sure about this? She's been nothing but trouble since we brought her in. Won't speak, won't cooperate," nearly bit Doc Henderson when he tried to examine her. Samuel climbed the steps slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening, the way he had learned to approach frightened animals. "It's all right, Clara," he said softly. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Up close, he could see the exhaustion beneath her defiance, the way her shoulders trembled slightly from hunger and fatigue. Her feet were bare and cut from walking on rough ground. "Sheriff," Samuel said, without taking his eyes off Clara, "I'd appreciate it if you'd remove those ropes now, Sam. She might run." "Then let her run." Samuel replied quietly, "A person's got a right to choose their own path." Jim reluctantly cut the ropes, and Clara rubbed her wrists where the rough hemp had chafed her skin. She looked at Samuel with curiosity, now rather than hostility, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of town," Samuel told her, his voice gentle as morning rain. "Good well water, clean beds, and more food than one old man can eat. You're welcome to stay as long as you like. No obligations, no conditions, just human kindness." Clara tilted her head, studying him the way a hawk studies the ground before deciding whether to dive. She didn't speak, but something in her posture softened slightly. The ride to Samuel's ranch passed in comfortable silence. Clara rode behind him on Chester, her arms loosely around his waist for balance. She smelled of sage and wood smoke, and something wild that reminded him of summer storms over the mountains. The ranch house was modest but well maintained. With a wraparound porch and windows that caught the evening light, Martha had planted roses by the front steps, and they still bloomed faithfully each spring even though she wasn't there to tend them. "There's a room upstairs," Samuel said as they dismounted. "Used to be my daughter's before she married and moved to California. Clean sheets and a wash basin I'll put together. Some supper while you get settled." Clara followed him inside her bare feet, silent on the wooden floors. She looked around the main room, taking in the simple furniture, the stone fireplace, the photographs on the mantel of Samuel with a gentle-faced woman and a young girl with ribbons in her hair. Samuel busied himself in the kitchen, grateful for something to do with his hands. He prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread with preserved peaches from Martha's last canning. The familiar motions soothed his nerves and reminded him of countless quiet evenings when love had filled this house like lamplight. When he called Clara to supper, she appeared wearing one of Martha's old dresses that he had left on the bed. It was too big for her small frame, but clean and mended. The sight of it didn't pain him as much as he expected. Instead, it felt right somehow, as if Martha would have approved. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls in the evening wind through the cottonwoods outside. Samuel noticed that Clara ate slowly, savoring each bite as someone who had known hunger learns to do. "I buried my wife last spring," Samuel said quietly, not really sure why he was sharing this. "Cancer took her. After 32 years of marriage, our daughter lives in San Francisco now with her husband and children." Clara looked up from her bowl but still didn't speak. Her green eyes were softer now in the lamplight, less wild and more simply sad. "Gets quiet out here," Samuel continued. "Sometimes I talk to the chickens just to hear a voice. Martha used to laugh at me for that. Said I'd end up like old Jeremiah who lived up Turkey Creek talking to rocks and trees." For the first time, Clara's mouth curved, in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Over the following days, they established a gentle routine. Samuel tended his small herd of cattle and worked on mending fences, while Clara seemed content to wander the property, exploring every corner of the ranch like someone mapping a new country. She showed no interest in leaving, and Samuel found himself looking forward to her quiet presence at meals and in the evenings, when they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge over the valley. Clara helped with small tasks without being asked, gathering eggs from the henhouse, weeding Martha's vegetable garden, drawing water from the well. Her movements had a natural grace, and she seemed to understand animals in a way that impressed Samuel. His old dog Rex, who had been listless and sad since Martha's death, perked up around Clara. She would sit with him on the porch, stroking his graying muzzle and whispering things Samuel couldn't hear. But Rex's tail wagged for the first time in months. "You've got a way with creatures," Samuel observed one evening as they watched a family of deer graze in the meadow beyond the barn. Clara had somehow convinced them that she posed no threat, and they barely lifted their heads when she moved. Clara turned to look at him, and for a moment Samuel thought she might speak, but instead she simply nodded and returned her attention to the deer. On a warm Tuesday morning, nearly 2 weeks after bringing Clara home, Samuel found her in Martha's garden, harvesting tomatoes and summer squash. She had braided her clean hair back from her face, and the sun had begun to restore color to her pale cheeks. "Clara," he said gently, "I want you to know you're not a prisoner here. If you want to leave, you can walk away. Anytime. You don't owe me anything for what I paid at that auction." She set down her basket and walked over to where he stood by the garden gate. For a long moment they looked at each other, and Samuel felt something pass between them that was deeper than words. Clara reached out and placed her hand over his heart, her palm warm through his cotton shirt. "Samuel," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but clear as spring water. "I love you." The words hit him like lightning, not because they were unexpected, but because he realized he had been hoping to hear them. Every quiet meal, every shared sunset, every small kindness had been building toward this moment of connection. Not the way a woman loves a man. Clara continued, her hand still resting over his heart. But the way one wounded soul loves another, foreseeing past the wounds to the person underneath. Samuel covered her hand with both of his own, feeling tears prick his eyes. "I know, darlin', I feel the same way. We're both survivors, aren't we? Just trying to figure out how to keep living after loss tried to break us. Clara nodded, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked truly peaceful. I lost everything in the influenza, she said quietly. My parents, my little brother, my fiancé, William. Everyone I loved died within a week of each other. So you went to live wild in the canyon? I couldn't bear to be around people anymore. All their